Hello, Serious Survivor here. And today I want to talk about some of the dangers of bugging out, some of the myths and realities around bugging out that we may not talk about a lot. Now, bugging out is, could be a necessity, but if it's not, then, it's something that I know I personally am not going to do. I'm going to stay as long as I can in my primary location. And it's going to take a lot to make me leave this location. It's going to be a have-to situation because this is where everything is at. And this is where I, as a prepper, and I, as a person, stand the best chance. If I'm in my town here, I live in a pretty small town, so, it's easy for me to say it's going to be safer here because it will be. If I lived in a large city, it would be completely different. But here, we're not a target. We're not a nuclear target. So things like that, we may not be as affected as drastically in the beginning as some other places are, but we will be affected as people migrate from these larger places and head to this type of area. And that's why instead of bugging out, for me, I want to be there, and I don't want laws, rules, restrictions, things such as that, someone placing themselves in charge without me having a say in it. And the other people that I care about having a say in this, I don't want someone just taking over because they happen to have the biggest or most guns right now. And that's something that we do have to take into account too. If it is a true world-ending event, then the shows we see like Mad Max and like The Purge and things like that, this is a real possibility, especially in the beginning. And if something isn't done in the beginning to slow this down, then that's the way it will be from there on out. There are a lot of people who thrive on chaos. There are a lot of people who will watch the world burn just for the sake of seeing the fire. And they only understand one language most of the time. So when it comes to reestablishing some type of order in, a post-apocalyptic scenario, then this is going to take people standing where they're at and not people bugging out. So bugging out, in my opinion, should be the last resort. Now, if we put some thought into and think just a little bit about what type of event would it take to force you to bug out from your home. So there's no two events the same. And we need to put a lot of thought into different types of events that are likely to happen. And we start thinking about nuclear war and things like that is devastating at various areas across the world, devastating simultaneously, destroying large cities across the world, then that will force people to bug out of their locations. And in situations like that, when you have thousands, tens of thousands, millions maybe, people leaving these larger locations, trying to find shelter, trying to find some sort of safety for at least a short period of time and to try and regroup, then you're going to run across a lot of people. It's going to be difficult to find an area or a location that isn't already occupied by at least one, maybe more people. So the psychological aspects of bugging out really will come into play, because without a plan or without knowledge of what's going on, because it's very likely an event's going to happen and we're going to be reacting to what we see locally, and we're not going to know what's going on across the entire world. So there will be that unknowing factor, that factor that we don't know what's going on. So should I go this way, or should I go that way, or should I stay right here? These are going to be difficult decisions to make, and they're possibly going to have to be made very quickly. Bugging out is, for as easy as it sounds and for as difficult as it sounds at the same time, it's going to hold a lot of hidden dangers, a lot of hidden pitfalls that we might not always, really take into consideration. One is, if you don't know the weather patterns, what you could expect weather-wise, temperature-wise, from the areas that you're bugging out to, then it's going to be difficult to make a plan to get to that area to begin with. But one of the most difficult parts is once you reach it, then that area, if you're not familiar with the weather patterns, then you just don't know what to expect. And I'll use the area that I live in for an example, and that's in the southeast United States, around South Carolina, Georgia, the mountainous area through there. If I have to bug out, we have locations in that direction and an alternative direction also. But if I go that way, if I have to bug out, then I know what to expect. In the summertime especially, the weather is going to be very volatile. There's a lot of afternoon, evening thunderstorms, and these are storms. They're pretty intense sometimes, and without the appropriate shelter, then it could be dangerous for an individual with mudslides, even lightning strikes and things such as that. But this is something you face every day in the area that I live in the mountainous regions. But if you're bugging out, then you're probably not the only one. If you're bugging out, I know me, if I'm bugging out, then it's gonna have to be a major event that I consider my home, my area here, my primary location, I consider it to be compromised, and that there's no possibility I'm gonna be able to maintain this area as a stronghold or as a primary location anymore. So I'm leaving it with the intention on I may never be able to return. So that in itself is gonna bring along some psychological issues. And even though we may overlook this, a lot of times we may not factor this into our planning. We really have to, especially if we have, very young children or even younger children or elderly people also in our group that have a difficult time making a physical journey like that. It's not going to be an easy journey for several reasons. One of those reasons being you're going to be carrying some gear, so that's extra mass that you're carrying, so it's going to be more difficult to physically make the journey to wherever you're going. If we're bugging out, then there's a good chance vehicles aren't running. If they are running, then things are simplified greatly at that point, and that does eliminate one of the major problems, and that's the issue of the transit from where you're going to your bug out location. And when we think about bugging out, it's going to take a major event in your area for most people to have to leave their home. Now, another important aspect of bugging out, and this is extremely important, and it is overlooked probably more than any of the rest of it, and that's for an inexperienced outdoors person to venture off into the woods in a bug out situation like this without the proper navigation skills, without a map and compass or extreme intimate knowledge of the terrain that you're in, then it's going to be very, very easy to get lost. And once you're lost in some of the larger forests here on the East Coast, there's a good chance you're not coming out if you don't know what you're doing. So this aspect alone, getting lost in the woods, is probably going to take more people's lives than we will ever know. And it's very easy to bug out into the woods, but it's hard to find your way out if you don't know how and if you don't know where you're at. So proper land navigation using a map, compass, is one of the most important skills if you're bugging out. You have to have this skill. Without this skill, you're relying on luck or you're relying on someone else's knowledge. If you're relying on a cell phone using GPS, that may not be around for very long. So don't put faith in that. Put faith in yourself and your ability to look at a map and a compass and determine where you are and where you need to go. That's an aspect that's going to claim a lot of people's lives in an emergency situation like this. So that's something that you can learn at home. You don't even have to go outside to learn a map and compass. You can learn that sitting in front of a computer, sitting here watching TV. We can learn how to do that. It's a very easy skill. But being able to do it will save your life in this type of situation. Another mistake of venturing out into the forest, the wilderness, if you get far enough away that you're not seeing other people anymore, then you're into an area of the forest that the forest is not used to seeing people, period. So when you venture out here, and the further we get away from people, then the less the wildlife will be afraid of people. And that means they will approach you, they will not fear you, and they will attack you if they feel threatened in the least. In my area of the country, there are a lot of different animals that could really hurt or even kill, a human being quite easily. And we're talking about bears, we're talking about some of the wildcats. There's not that many wildcats anymore, but some of them, we have large dogs, wolves, things such as that. And then there's also the timber rattlers, and there's also the copperheads, poisonous snakes. And these animals will attack if they feel threatened. So even if we don't threaten these animals, even if we mean them no harm, they're not really afraid of us when they're that far out because they haven't seen what man does to animals generally. So they're not afraid of us, and they will quite possibly, defend themselves or approach us in an aggressive manner. But when you're in the middle of the woods and you get an infection from an animal bite and you don't have any type of medication to treat it, then this could be pretty bad, especially if you're far away. from civilization, and by the time someone leaves your area, makes it back to the town, and if they do find medicine and come back, then it may very well be too late. Other aspects in the woods, what time of year is it? Do you change your plan, your bug out plan, due to the fact that it's summer as opposed to winter? And it should change. It should change dramatically depending on where you live. I know where I live, you could walk into the mountains in summer, and if you're prepared for it and if you understand the dangers that you face, you can survive from a climate standpoint. But in the wintertime, the same area of the country, no, it doesn't get 20 below zero here, but it definitely is cold enough for hypothermia to kill you in a few hours here. So knowing what you need to survive and being reasonable about this. If I have to make a 50-mile journey through the woods, it's 50 miles straight away on a highway. It's going to take me an hour in a car. 50 miles through a mountainous region that I'm zigzagging a course, through the woods, it's going to take me days. So being prepared for that long of a journey, we have to take that into mind. It's not feasible for me to say, I'm going to bug out to this location 120 miles from my primary location, and I'm going to do this in January. No, it's probably not going to happen, not unless I have the appropriate gear, and that's where your kits will have to change up, your bags will have to change up as the seasons change. Prepping's not just something we do and put in a closet and forget about. It's something we have to actively modify, we have to actively check on, and you always want your gear in the tip-top condition. Another aspect of bugging out into the wilderness or an area like that is the lack of communications that we'll have from that point out. Now, if we don't know what type of event that has occurred, if we're unsure about exactly what has happened, what the scope of it is, how far it reaches, is it worldwide, is it just national, is it international, then bugging out to some remote wilderness location may not be a good choice, because it's going to be difficult to establish any type of communications there unless you're carrying a satellite phone with you with a receiver large enough or transmitter large enough to get your signal out and to receive signals. So the lack of communication can actually be an extremely major part of this, because if we do bug out to a location and we can't communicate, then when the situation gets better, how do we know? If the situation gets worse, how do we know? We have no means of communication, no way of knowing what's wrong, what's going on at this current time. Are the good guys winning? Are the bad guys winning? We don't even know what's happening. So not having any communication is detrimental on its own, because the lack of information will either isolate us further and make us stay further back in an area such as this, or either make us curious and want to come back into town, and maybe it's not the right time. So we have to keep this in mind when we're bugging out, and formulating a plan ahead of time, saying that, well, if it's this type of event, nuclear fallout, I know it's going to take about, if these are surface bursts, then I know it's going to take, a couple of weeks to a month, probably about 2 weeks before the initial fallout's going to, level out a little bit, and I can start approaching these areas. I don't want to definitely go into these areas, but I can start approaching them and seeing what's going on. But we need to formulate plans like this if you are going to go very far out into the wilderness and you're planning on staying there. There's going to be a lot of choices that we're faced with, a lot of difficult choices that any modern, civilized, if you will, society, that we never have to face or deal with most of these choices. But there will be choices that there's no clear-cut right or wrong answer, only what's going to benefit you or what's going to benefit someone else. Every decision will be different, every choice will be different, but the choices that we make are what will shape the future that we live. I hope you enjoyed the video. Got some really good ones coming out soon, and thanks a lot for watching. For now, Serious Survivor, out.